look up, and if the underside of the aircraft above you is painted silver, it's American. If it's painted black, it's British. And if it doesn't show up at all, it's German.
The Allies might have complete control of the skies, but on the ground, the terrain favoured the Germans, who were now entrenched in Normandy's bocage landscape. Bocage country was made up of small fields, about 100 or 200 metres square, bounded by earth banks with hedges on top. Cecil Newton was a tank gunner.
Gunnery Sergeant Arlie Ermy here. On this episode, we're talking about what really makes guns deadly weapons. Ammunition! You can't have weapons without ammo. They go together like, well, guns and ammo. We've seen all kinds of fancy firearms on this show. But what they shoot has changed a heck of a lot over the centuries as well. From simple lead balls to self-contained rounds of ammo that can do this. So pass the ammunition. It's time to lock and load. Now, if any of you are thinking, great, a show all about bullets, then think again, ladies. Let's just get one thing straight right now. This is not a bullet. It is a round of ammunition. This is the projectile. This is the casing, the shell casing. Right back here we have what is called a primer. Inside is black smokeless powder. The firing pin hits the primer, which ignites the smokeless powder, which then pushes.
By the final months of 1944, the Eastern Front of the Second World War had collapsed into a state of total disintegration for the Third Reich. Following the catastrophic defeat of Army Group Center during Operation Bagration in mid-1944 and the subsequent Soviet advances across Poland and the Baltics,
Operation Barbarossa was the inevitable conclusion of the former partnership between the two dictators. Hitler and Stalin probably both knew that in the end they would have to battle it out. Hitler was faster, but Stalin was far more crafty, and with the help of FDR, he would, as we will know, prevail and ensure the certainty of the Cold War. And that is quite a loaded statement after 80 years of a narrative that Hitler's expansionist policies, he simply wanted to conquer more territory for Germany and jumped the poor unprepared Stalin who hid in his dacha, while his antiquated military was destroyed at will by superior German war machines. And as nobody can claim Hitler innocent of most things during the Second World War, that is a pretty easy sell. But what was Stalin doing, and had been doing, in the previous 20 years? How had he constructed his military and tested it? He was every bit the dictator that Hitler was, except by the time of 1940, he had killed far more people over his own and other countries than Hitler had or would. By 1941, Stalin had invaded the same amount of countries that Hitler had, yet the Western Allies conveniently forgot all about that and sided with Stalin and helped him. Lord knows they helped him with war materials, food, weapons, money, steel, factories, grain, know-how to a staggering degree, as I will begin to cover. But why would the Americans especially choose to back a communist dictator and not the National Socialist one? American banks and industrialists were far more engaged in Germany than in Russia, who had not even honored that country's debt as the communists took over. The relationship between Stalin and FDR and the infiltration of the FDR government is a key component of how the war unfolded. The aid was released and the Cold War resulted from that. Before that, Russia had spent a decade trading with Western nations to cut the technology gap exponentially, which they did. And it was done with blood of millions of Russians, Ukrainians, and many others. And then there was the learning curve for the military. Most people may never have heard about the war against the Japanese army in Kangin Gol. It was 1,000 kilometers from the Russian civilization, and it was a crushing victory, but was never really publicized, not even by Stalin. It was a quiet lesson learned by the Russian Army and Air Force, a masterpiece in logistical buildup, staggering camouflage, and a fiercely aggressive combined attack with tanks and ground attack planes, in a deployment which was identical to that in the month before Barbarossa. Many of you may be aware of the book written by Viktor Suvorov, a former KGB officer. Herein he laid out in detail how Stalin was planning an attack on the West, after Germany and the Allies had torn themselves to pieces. In fact, Stalin was in the final stages of readiness, preparing for his attack on Germany to begin on July 6, 1941. The Russian forces were massing for a rapid advance, leaving them exposed to an attack and being surrounded themselves, which is exactly what happened. And looking at the number of forces from 1939 to 1940, Stalin mobilized his army from 1.8 million men in 1939 to 5 million plus in June 1941, as the Germans had 128 divisions facing Russia, while the Russians had 174 facing west. Germany had 35,928 guns and mortars facing east. The Russians had almost 60,000 facing west. The Germans had 3,700 tanks, many of them Panzer Is and IIs, light or medium tanks. The Russians had 15,687 tanks and 10,743 aircraft against the Germans' 3,425. It makes less sense, since historically speaking, you need a lower number of defenders in order to defend than you do for attack. Suvorov's main argument is that Stalin had planned for an attack, not for defense, and was not positioned well at all for defense, which the events proved correct, given the amount of prisoners taken by the Germans initially. Also, the Stalin line had been stripped of weaponry mostly, and obviously there were many Western historians who were quick to criticize and dismiss Suvorov's claim, despite his background as an intelligence officer with the KGB, having had access to the documents, none of which Western historians had until decades later. And generally the claim was neglected or downplayed, which is understandable given how many networks and historians have rather left-leaning inclinations. But recently, more and more mainstream historians have begun to come around to the point that it seems more and more likely that Stalin had been planning his Western expansion for many years. After all, one does not just build up a huge military with 5 million active soldiers in a year's time, responding to Hitler's threat after signing a peace treaty with him. It takes a long time to deploy and develop a doctrine, training the men, trial and error, equipment, machinery, and the Russian military in 1940 was standing on a decade of development, construction, production, and training, but also on the experience of several significant wars they had fought or participated in. And one is little known, the other we know of, the Finnish Winter War. But have we drawn the right conclusions from that? I think it is time we begin to settle this argument, because it makes a difference, especially now where we see the rise of communism and Marxism across the West. These are bad ideas which travel, and we need to understand where they came from and how they travel. Stalin was a communist, a stone-cold killer, and the very foundation for his ideology is for it to spread, As Lenin would say, the goal of the revolution is to spread, namely to spread communism. So a military designed by communists must have a doctrine embedded in it, thus one of aggression, an aggressive advance. And that is exactly what Stalin built. A large, fast-moving, aggressive military. Certainly not one for defense and passivity. So over the next episodes, I will go over what lessons the Russians had learned from their wars, the politics and the hardware. What were they actually building? Because depending on the military doctrine, you construct hardware accordingly. But before we talk politics, they are after all dirtier than sin, let's take a look at the first war in case. Khankin Gol. The Battle of Khankin Gol was initially a series of engagements fought from May to September 1939 along the border between Mongolia and Manchukuo. This was Japanese-controlled Manchuria, near the Khankin Gol River, which is 7,000 kilometers from Moscow and 1,000 kilometers from the closest Russian base, and that is significant. What is interesting is that it was the largest tank battle in history at that time. Khankin Gol River marked the contested frontier between Mongolia, a Soviet-aligned state, and Manchukuo, a Japanese puppet state, established after the Japanese 1931 invasion of Manchuria. The Japanese Kwanton Army operated semi-autonomously, sought to expand Japanese influence into Soviet-controlled territories, eyeing Mongolia and Siberia for resources. The Soviets, wary of Japanese aggression and well aware of developments in Europe to her west, Stalin was determined to defend his Mongolian ally further incursions. The conflict started with minor skirmishes and built up into a major engagement involving over 100,000 troops, hundreds of tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. By August 1939, Soviet-Mongolian forces under General George Zhukov, yes, him, numbered approximately 57 to 60,000 personnel. This included Soviet troops and Mongolian units, primarily from the 1st Soviet-Mongolian Army Group. General Georgy Zhukov, then he was a 42-year-old corps commander with Russian Civil War experience. He led the Soviet forces. His chief of staff, Isai Bogdanov, and other officers later became key figures in World War II. General Georgy Stim, commander of the Transbaikal Military District, oversaw logistics. The Soviets deployed 844 tanks and armored vehicles, including BT-7s, fast light armored tanks with a 45mm gun, effective in open terrain. Then T-26 light tanks with similar armament used for infantry support. Also a bunch of armored cars, BA-10, BA-20 models for reconnaissance and rapid strikes. They had over 500 artillery pieces, including 76mm field guns and 122mm howitzers, providing overwhelming firepower. The Soviets transported 18,000 tons of artillery shells, with 3,800 trucks and 1,375 fuel tankers, over 868 miles through desert routes, and that is significant. The Soviet Air Force conducted 2,015 bomber sorties and 18,509 fighter sorties, expending over 1,000,000 7.62mm rounds and over 68,000 20mm cannon rounds and 1,200 tons of bombs. The aircraft used were the I-15, I-16, and some older 153s. Many pilots were veterans from the Spanish Civil War, having given them combat experience and an edge. That was another war Stalin got involved in and came out of with the entire gold supply of Spain in return for relatively little. Now, the real story here is that the Soviets overcame a 434-mile distance, about 1,000 kilometers from their nearest railhead in Borgusha, employing a massive logistical effort to sustain through some of the worst and most inhospitable terrain and desert ever. The operations in the desert. Now imagine what it takes to transport by truck that much material and people that far. Not only did they have to move all the material, but they also had fuel for themselves and spare parts for their journey. and the buildup was done in secrecy. The Japanese had no idea. Russian officers all took off their insignia, traveled as workers or private soldiers. Units were disguised and boarded privately or in the field, and everybody had to be fed as well, and also the positions had to be constructed and camouflaged. The Japanese 6th Army, primarily the 23rd Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Michitara Kumbasu, fielded approximately 40,000 troops, with an estimate of up to 75 to 80,000 at its peak. Manchukuo's cavalry infantry supplemented these forces, and Japanese forces were well trained and combat experienced in the area as well. The Japanese deployed around 180 tanks, significantly fewer than the Soviets, including Type 95 light tanks with 37mm guns, underpowered against Soviet armor. The Type 89 medium tanks, slow and outdated. The Japanese used tanks in small piecemeal formations as infantry support per their doctrine. And this is at a time where we need to understand that tank doctrine was still something most armies around the world were still very conflicted on. But the French doctrine, for instance, was similar to this. They fielded about 130 artillery pieces, including 75mm field guns and mortars, but lacking the volume and range of Soviet artillery. The Japanese Army Air Force flew an estimated 10,000 fighter and bomber sorties, firing 1.6mm 7.7 rounds and dropping 907 tons of bombs. They flew the Nakajima Ki-27 modern monoplane fighter, competitive but outnumbered, and the Kawasaki Ki-10, an older biplane fighter, outclassed by the Soviet I-16s. At the end of the battle, they lost 162 aircraft and 152 dead and 66 severely wounded aircrew. The Japanese, however, had a logistical advantage, with railheads only 100 miles from Nohaman and 2 dirt roads to the front, compared to the Soviets, about 1,000 kilometer supply line. However, their intelligence failed to anticipate the Soviet buildup, which is noteworthy. The Russians moved a huge force in secrecy, doubling the Japanese. Soviet tanks, particularly the BT-7, was faster. It was better armed than the Japanese light tanks. Soviet aircrafts, bolstered by Spanish Civil War experience, outperformed the Japanese air forces in coordination and numbers. Now, the doctrine emphasized infantry-centric tactics, night attacks, and Bushido-inspired aggression, with tanks used sparingly as support. Soviet doctrine under Zhukov prioritized combined arms, integrating tanks, artillery, air support for decisive maneuvers. Now, this was, true, not a million-man large-scale battle. It was, however, a multifaceted battle, almost a large-scale sand table exercise where he could truly test the Soviet doctrine and polish the rough edges. The war began on May 8, 1939, with initial skirmishes between the Mongolians, Japanese drawing in Russian troops to support the Mongolians, inflicting 63% casualties on the Japanese. They were commanded by Colonel Yasutsu Atsuma when initially surrounding the Japanese, who then returned with the 2nd Air Brigade and attacked